The history of the Indian people of Maine. This slide program is a very general overview of Maine Indian history. It is divided into 5 main areas: a history of the Indian people before the arrival of the white man, their religion, housing, education, and basket making. The first slide you should see before you on the screen bears the title Indian Pride. This program is produced by Project Indian Pride and the Office of Maine Indian Education. Greetings from the people of the dawn, the Wabanaki Indians. Long ago, there was only the sky, the sea, and the forest. Then a wondrous giant, Glooskap, appeared. Glooskap was all-wise and powerful, more than a mortal, but less than a god. First, Glooskap made men. Taking a great bow, he shot arrows into the trunks of ash trees. Out of the trees stepped men and women, strong and graceful, with light brown skin and shining black hair. Glooskap called them the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. Next, Glooskap made the animals, the deer, the rabbit, the bear, all the creatures, until the forest was alive and singing, and the world was good. Glooskap knew what was in the hearts of all men and animals. He helped them in their daily life. Glooskap had magic powers. He used these magic powers for good. But now Lox, the evil one, appeared on Earth. Lox could take the form of a badger, a beaver, or a wolverine, or as something of all three. Lox too had magic powers, but he used these powers wrongly. He used these powers for evil. This is the way the Wabanaki explained the origin of their people and the presence of good and evil in the world. The Wabanaki, or people of the dawn, were a part of the larger Algonquin nation, or language grouping, which was made up of several tribes, among whom were the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot in what is now Maine, and the Maliseet of New Brunswick in Canada. Scientists tell us that the first native peoples came to Maine about 7,000 years ago from the northwest, about the time of the last ice age. In those early centuries, the climate of Maine was much colder. The forests were thinner, and herds of caribou roamed the land. The sea contained large fish, and even whales were frequently seen and hunted. The Indian people hunted and traveled the sea in dugout canoes, which were large and sturdy. They hunted the land in groups of many hunters, searching for the caribou. As the hundreds and thousands of years passed, the climate slowly changed and warmed. The forests became more dense, with new kinds of trees and bushes. The caribou and whales moved north and were replaced by the solitary moose and by porpoise and pollock and a whole new variety of fish and mammal. As the climate and the food supply changed, so also did the way of life of the people. Instead of large groups of hunters going out for meat, they now went hunting in small groups or individually, seeking the shy moose, the rabbit, and the deer. The canoes were now of birch bark and moose hide, light and swift, to chase the elusive porpoise and the other smaller sea mammal and fish. The way of life of the Wabanaki people adapted and adjusted to fit their environment and their needs. In 1604, a small fleet of French ships arrived at the island in the river they were to name St. Croix. This was to be the second year-round European settlement in the eastern part of the continent north of Florida. The first was a Portuguese settlement in Nova Scotia 100 years earlier. This small French colony was the first official contact between the Passamaquoddy and Maliseet people and the French government. These first early contacts were friendly, and it was perhaps due to the respect shown by the French leader Champlain for these Indian people he called Etchemin that the Abenaki became such faithful allies to the French. This was also the first contact of the Indian people with the French Catholic black-robed missionaries. Over a century passed, and it was now the middle of the 18th century. The Indian village at Norridgewock, outside of present-day Augusta, Maine, had been destroyed by the English troops and their Mohawk scouts. Most of the people had been killed, along with their French Jesuit priest, Father Sebastian Rao. The church was burned, and the scalps of the victims taken to Boston for the bounty and paraded through the streets. The Abenaki people had become devout and intensely loyal Catholic Christians during the previous 100 or more years. The degree of their loyalty can be seen in the following quote when the English tried to draw the Indian people away from the Catholic Church. The English had offered to rebuild the Norridgewock Church at their own expense if the Indian people would accept an English Protestant minister to serve them. The following angry reply was given by the Indian representative. When you first came here, you saw me long before the French governors, but neither your predecessors nor your ministers ever spoke to me of prayer or the Great Spirit. They saw my furs, my beaver and moose skins, and of this alone they thought. These alone they sought, and so eagerly that I have not been able to supply them enough. When I had much, they were my friends, and only then. One day my canoe missed the route. I lost my path and wandered a long way at random until I landed near Quebec, in a great village of the Algonquins, where the Blackgowns were teaching. Scarcely had I arrived when one of them came to see me. I was loaded with furs, but the Blackgown of France disdained to look at them. He spoke to me of the Great Spirit, of heaven, of hell, of the prayer, which is the only way to reach heaven. I heard with pleasure and was so delighted with his words that I remained in the village near him. At last the prayer pleased me, and I was instructed. I solicited baptism, and the black robe happily agreed. After being baptized, I returned home to my people and related all that had happened. All envied my happiness and wished to partake it. They too went to the Blackgown to be baptized. Thus have the French acted. Had you spoken to me of the prayer as soon as we met, I should be now so unhappy as to pray like you, for or I could not have told whether your prayer was good or bad. Now I hold to the prayer of the French. I agree to it. I shall be faithful to it even until the earth is burnt and destroyed. Keep your men, your gold, and your minister. I will go to my French father. Throughout the years since that time, the Abenaki people have remained almost 100% Catholic Christians. Several years later, at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, when the colonies needed the support, or at least the neutrality, of the Indian people in the war against the English, treaties were negotiated. The state promised, among other things, to provide a Catholic priest to the Indian people at the government's expense. At least in this, the Americans kept their promise. The salaries of the priests on the 3 reservations and the fuel bills of the churches were paid by the state for 200 years until 1977, when the state of Maine broke the agreement and cut off all support for the churches and missionaries. The Indian people kept their part of the agreement well. In the Battle of Machias, Maine, the Passamaquoddy turned the tide of battle and saved eastern Maine for the United States. A Passamaquoddy marksman shot the British captain off the bridge of his ship out in the bay, effectively ending the battle. The Indian was given the name Neptune in gratitude and in honor of the god of the sea. John Neptune became the first of a family name which has continued down to the present day. In 1794, the state of Massachusetts set apart a reservation of land at Pleasant Point near Eastport and at a place which was later to be called Indian Township or Peter Dana Point near Princeton, Maine. Maine was at this time a part of Massachusetts. In 1818, the reservation at Indian Island, just north of Bangor, was created. In 1820, Maine became a state and took upon itself all the obligations of the state of Massachusetts toward the Indians of Maine. In 1823, a Protestant minister named Elijah Kellogg arrived at Pleasant Point to teach religion, English language, and agriculture. Mr. Kellogg opened a school in 1824 called the Quoddy School, which was supported by both the state and the federal government. When in 1828 a Catholic priest arrived to take over the school, Mr. Kellogg refused to turn it over. The Indian people split between Mr. Kellogg and the Catholic Church, and as a result, the federal government withdrew its support of the school. The school closed, the priest was recalled to Boston, and Mr. Kellogg left. It wasn't until 1859 that the state again provided funds for Indian education. Since the reservation schools had no heat, they were only open during the warm months of the year. In 1879, the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic religious congregation, took over the teaching in Indian schools, with a resulting rise in the quality of education the people received. In 1880, jurisdiction over the schools was given to Indian agents and resident priests, and in 1905, the state gave the governor of Maine and his council the right of approval over all funds spent by the Indian agents. The Passamaquoddy and Penobscot talent for weaving the beautiful baskets for which they are so noted developed and matured during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As time went on, the people settled into reservation life, where their source of income became basket making, while they hunted and fished for their food. During the 1920s and 1930s, people from the 3 main reservations traveled up and down the New England states to the various fairs and expositions, selling their beautiful baskets to the tourists. It was a time of relative contentment for the Indian people of Maine. We were poor, some elders have said, but we cared for one another. People did not demand things of one another, but bartered for what they needed. a cup of sugar for some flour, some moose meat for coffee, value for value, goods for goods. Much of the social life of the reservations centered around the Catholic Church and its feast days. During spring, the Feast of Corpus Christi, the Body of Christ, was a time of celebration. It was a time of processions and sporting events. Even during the times when there was no resident priest, the people would gather in the church for worship and sing the entire Latin Mass from memory, led by the catechists and the sisters. The Passamaquoddies had a small but excellent band. Many of the performers were real artists. The band was employed during the summer months at the seaside resorts of Maine, Massachusetts, and New York. One family furnished a trio, father, son, and daughter, saxophonists in a first-class traveling Wild West show. During the two World Wars, Indian volunteerism for the U.S. and Canadian Armed Forces was high, even though they were exempted from the draft. The Indian people of Maine did not have all the rights or obligations of U.S. citizenship. They did not receive the right to vote in national elections until 1953, and 1967 was the first time Maine Indians could vote for district state representatives. This right to vote came almost 50 years after passage of the Federal Citizenship Act of 1924, which gave citizenship to all Native Americans. It was in the 1950s that things began to change dramatically for the Indian people of Maine. During this time, outhouses and wells were replaced by indoor plumbing and a sewer system. An Indian Housing Authority was formed, and funds were sought to begin the construction of new and better housing. During the 1960s and 1970s, the housing construction passed through several different stages and housing designs, as federal grants were applied for and received. The last 20 and 30 years have brought much economic progress and financial benefits to the Indian people. At the same time, this economic progress has resulted in a sharp rise in the population of the reservations, along with the arrival of all the social problems and temptations that were previously thought to be found only in the larger cities. The Abenaki people have suffered many assaults upon them, both physical and spiritual, and have survived through much poverty and deprivation. They now find themselves in a new battle for survival against the most destructive enemy of all, easy money and affluence. They must face the future with their greatest weapons: courage, imagination, and education. Let us all hope with them that they succeed.